Lep pozdrav vsem prisotnim in tistim na spletu. Dobrodošli na zadnjem dnevu festivala Zgodovina na Špici. Welcome everybody on the last event of the festival History on the Edge. It's my pleasure today to host a presentation of a brand new book, Making Sense of Dictatorship, Domination and Everyday Life in East Central Europe after 1945. The book is edited by Celia Donert, Anna Kladnik and Martin Sabrow and published by European University Press. I'm very pleased that two guests join us here today for the presentation. Anna Kladnik, one of the editors and one of the authors, and Matej Spurny, one of the authors. So let me first briefly introduce our guests and then we will go straight to the book presentation. Anna Kladnik is currently a researcher at the Institute of Contemporary History in Ljubljana. She previously held visiting professorships at the University of Pittsburgh, University of Liverpool, and Charles University in Prague, as well as fellowships in Potsdam, Berlin, Sarajevo, and Vienna. She was recently awarded a Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellowship for the project A Land of Joiners, a gender history of volunteer fire departments on free border region of the East Central Europe in times of political transformations. Congratulations for this achievement.
Thank you.
And Matej Spurny is Associate Professor of Social History at the Charles University in Prague and researcher at the Institute of Contemporary History of the Czech Academy of Sciences. He previously held fellowships in Jena, Berlin, Potsdam, and Marburg, and he is the author of several monographs in Czech, English, and German. His work on ethnic minorities in post-war Czechoslovakia was awarded prestigious Czech academic and research prizes. So thank you very much that you joined us here today for the presentation. And Anna is one of the editors. Could you please tell us a bit more about the structure and the content of the book?
Of course. Thank you, Maja, for your introduction. Yes, you mentioned that this is a brand new book, but this book was a very long time in the making. It is a result of the project which had started already in 2007 and ended in 2010. The project was called The Socialist Dictatorship as a Sinnwelt and was jointly carried out at the Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam, or maybe better known as Zentrum für Zeithistorische Forschung, CZF, and the Institute for Contemporary History in Prague. This project is actually not unknown for the Slovenian academic public. Some of the colleagues from the Institute participated in the project conferences, and also my translation of Pavel Kolář's text, where he explained what the project is about, was published in 2008 in Zgodovina za vse, and in 2009 in Prispevki za novejšo zgodovino. Maybe you can take a look. Thank you. So I already mentioned Pavel Kolář. He's now professor at the University of Constance and was at the time of the Sinnwelt project researcher at the CZF in Potsdam. And he was the main force in developing this project. Also, I would like to immediately mention Michal Kopeček from the Institute of Contemporary History and Michal Pullman from the Charles University, who were also greatly responsible in the making and later managing and supervising the project in Prague. Pavel and Michal Kopeček have also written the foreword to the book. And I would also like to mention Martin Sabrow, one of the book's co-editor, who was at the time when the project was in the making, the director of the CZF. The project tried to explain how the communist systems in East Central Europe were established, continued, and then collapsed from the comparative perspective and the viewpoints of cultural, social, and history of everyday life. It tried to examine what lay behind the power politics and raw ideology, and examine the production of different worlds of meaning, or Sinnwelten, of different groups of citizens, how they were experienced and how they changed over time. And I believe that Matej will later on explain more into details about the the concept of the Sinnwelt. The research team comprised of PhD students and postdoctoral researchers, mostly from several countries of East Central Europe. And also the contributors of the book, all except one, are based in Europe, and more than a half in East Central Europe. All contributors of the book closely collaborated in the project for all 3 years and joined as visiting fellows, like Celia Donert, the third co-editor of the book, who is today associate professor at the University of Cambridge. Chronologically, the articles in the book cover all stages of state socialism, the Stalinist building of socialism, de-Stalinization, the reform period, late stage socialism, and finally its collapse. The fundamental question addressed in this collection is how political power worked in state socialism. It asks what conditioned the long-term conformist behavior of the majority of the population in communist states in Europe, and why at the end of the 1980s people decided to reject this world. In the introductory part, Martin Sabrow sets out the fundamental question of a cultural historical approach to the history of modern dictatorships. The ideological infrastructure of the state socialist regimes is further discussed in the essay by Thomas Lindenberger. When it comes to the experience and behavior of average people, historical research on communist rule tended to juxtapose the numerous instances of consent in normal times to episodes of popular unrest and revolt during the states of exception. Lindenberger's paper proposes a view beyond this dichotomy by introducing the concept of eigensinn, which puts individuals' strategies of muddling through the challenges of real socialism and their need to get along with authorities and their social environment at the center of analysis. The second part of the volume deals with the different ways in which citizens experienced the power structures of communist domination. Ciprian Cerniala concentrates on the life in Romanian people's policemen during the late socialist period. Cerniala argues that conformity and resistance coexisted, while regime legitimacy and its laws were not necessarily opposites, but two sides of the same coin. The chapter by Hedwig Richter aims to analyze the information reports produced by the bureaucratic apparatus outside the domain of the Ministry of State Security. According to Richter, this reporting system enabled a much tighter surveillance than state security could supply, while the citizens perceived these information reports as being legitimate. Michal Pullman addresses the discussions of Czechoslovak economists in the 1980s and show that their disagreements about practical and political questions paradoxically strengthened the existing political consensus rather than weakening it. In their critique of economic policy, experts used the established ideological lexicon whereby they were confirming the validity of the existing political order. It was only the onset of perestroika or reconstruction when the ideological semantics of socialism began to disintegrate, which opened the way for the collapse of the late socialist consensus. Then the next broader set of articles deal with everyday social practices in state socialism as a zone in which the protagonists constructed the meaning of the existing social order, and in which everyday social actions not only reinforce the legitimacy of the socialist social order, but also delegitimized it. Drawing on the example of Velenje, a new town in Slovenia, in my own article, I show how the politics of socialist self-management encourage practices of voluntary work and self-imposed contributions, which legitimize the autonomous function of the municipality in its local communities. In her contribution on washing machine distribution practices before and after 1956 in Hungary, Anina Gagiova illustrates how, beyond the actual sphere of politics, an increase of consumption was to help the population become relatively satisfied with the socialist system. Gagiova also highlights how, In a socialist state, one world of meaning was replaced with another in order for the state to achieve widespread acceptance. The representation of the desired social order and the fear of dangerous pathologies was, according to Barbara Klich-Kluczewska, a key thread of the social discourse in the People's Republic of Poland. In the era of late socialism, single, mostly young mothers become an important topic in expert debates and popular media. Teenage motherhood created social resentment and caused loneliness for the mothers who had to cope with everyday life problems during a period of economic shortages and social constraints. Social taboo, Klich-Kluczewska argues, is the key concept for understanding the everyday social practices of marginalized groups during the economic crisis of the 1980s. Celia Donert's chapter, meanwhile, uses a case study of a Kinderladen, an anti-authoritarian creche, established in inner city East Berlin during the 1980s to ask how the gendered experience of everyday life shaped East German dissidents' engagement with official and unofficial discourses of peace and human rights in the final years of socialist rule. The last set of articles deal with the Sinnwelt of intellectuals and experts. Writing about the destruction of the old mining town of Most and the construction of a new Most in Czechoslovakia, Matej Spurny shows the extent to which the state gradually integrated the starting points of critical discourse into the ideological structure of real socialism. Peter Apor examines the idea of authentic community among Hungarian intellectuals and activists, which was one of the important cultural themes and social practices in the 1960s and 70s across the globe. It argues that the use of the concept was an important context for coming to terms with the legacy of Marxism and was also instrumental for interpreting the meaning of socialism and capitalism in both East and West. The concept of authentic community helped to formulate powerful criticism of alienation and the consumer society, which connected to concerns of socialist elites, intellectuals, secular and religious critical thinkers, and activists. The contribution of Jonathan Larsson surveys the different pictures we gain of the nature and extent of samizdat, periodical publishing in late socialist Czechoslovakia, from different archival collections. Larsson argues that examining different approaches to collecting and curating late socialist samizdat periodicals offers us a view into the making of contemporary global history and theories for its interpretation. And finally, Michal Kopeček argues in his contribution that communist law, along with the steady rise of the communist normative state, was becoming a part of the systemic form of normality, accepted not only by the ruling party and its apparatus, but also by major part of the population. Kopeček shows how legal and political theorists in Czechoslovakia and Poland engage with socialist legality and dissident legalism as a strategy in their contest with the regime.
Okay, great. Thank you for this overview. So in the last decades, many studies have focused on the state-society relations in communist regimes using different perspectives, approaches, concepts. And some of them have really effectively shown that people in state socialisms were not only passive recipients of the communist domination, but also active social agents. So basically the permanent process of negotiation was at play between the authorities and societies. And this particular book employs a concept of Sinnwelt as its core concept. So Matej, could you please tell us a bit more about this conceptual framework? Why have you decided for Sinnwelt? And what can this concept reveal about state-society relations in state socialisms that might otherwise stay hidden?
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful place and to this today's presentation. Well, the question is, of course, once I have sort of to create a narrative about Sinnwelt, where to start. And when I thought about it, I of course came to the conclusion that I have to start in 1989 and to say a few words about the situation in historiography in Central Eastern Europe in the 90s, to sort of explain the initial thoughts and the way to this Sinnwelt project. I mean, of course, when the new regimes in 1989 were being found in Central Eastern Europe on the ruins of communist rule, of course, as you are, I mean, as you know, as scholars of history or people interested in contemporary history, every modern social order is founded also on the denial of its predecessor, and thus every political regime tries to a certain extent to control the manner in which history, especially recent history, is told and written. And this, of course, was the part, was the case also of historicizing state socialist era in post-socialist Central Eastern Europe. After 1990, not only politicians and leaders of state-sponsored memory institutions, but also most historians in the post-communist countries of Central Eastern Europe found it difficult to resist political pretense and social demands to sort of add content to the ideology of democratic transformation and conform in their language and interpretation to the great story of struggle against totalitarianism, for freedom, democracy, and the struggle of the oppressed nation against the communist evil, as if this evil was coming from outside. Most of these historians accepted the omnipresent anti-totalitarian code, which they used as an instrument for selecting and interpreting historical sources. The official policies on memory and historical interpretation in the first 2 decades after the fall of communism thus coincided to a significant degree in their basic points of departure, creating quite a one-sided and dichotomous concept of post-war history based on we and they, regime and society, communists and the nation, or perpetrators and victims. And at the end of the 1990s, and also in the first decade of the 21st century, as the neoliberal or liberal regimes in Central Eastern Europe went through several crises, the need for legitimizing them as the only possible by historical narratives became even stronger and more urgent. And that was the reason for grounding powerful state-sponsored institutions of memory, such as the Polish or Slovak Institute of the Memory of the Nation, or the Czech Institute for Study of Totalitarian Regimes. And these institutions had and still have the ambition to determine the art of historical research as well. With other words, there was like to sponsor massively the research of oppression, power misuse, and suffering in state socialist era, and to assure that common knowledge about these regimes would be based on 2 pillars in the future: on the documentation of physical violence caused by them, and on the authentic experience of the victims. This state of things was in 2007 the point of departure of the project, Socialist Dictatorship as Sinnwelt, or as the word of meaning, of the Institute for Contemporary History of the Czech Academy of Science and ZZF, as Anna was telling. So with other words, this was a project designed by German and Czech scholars mostly, of younger generation originally, which had the ambition to challenge this one-sided perspective, at least in the field of historical science. But I mean, it's useless to say probably that this project never had the ambition to deny the violent and dictatorial character of state socialist rule over the Central Eastern European countries after 1945. I mean, violence organized by the state socialist regime against its political enemies and groups not integrated into the system for various reasons was one of the pillars of its architecture. So this was never denied, but what we in the beginning saw as a problem and still see as a problem was that this main dominating discourse about communist dictatorship, or the view reducing communist dictatorship to a sort of leviathan, as Martin Sabrow puts it, and making people believe that violence, ideological manipulation, and secret police were the only instruments which held communist parties for more than 40 years at power, that this narrative does not have, from our point of view, the capacity to explain the internal forces which were decisive for the rise of the socialist dictatorship, which stabilized it for decades, and whose erosion in 1980s was decisive for the decline of communist rule over certain Central Eastern Europe. And this one-sided view, as we see it, also often did and does not meet the everyday experience of the many, of those who were in this narrative reduced to passive victims or bystanders, but were in fact active actors of the past. So this is the point of departure, and this was the reason why the designers of the Sinnwelt project wanted the Central Eastern European historiography to pose different questions, or maybe one could say to pose questions at all, unless to document already prepared answers. Questions about continuities and ruptures, about the passive acceptance of ideology, about the stabilizing and destabilizing aspects of communist rule, about the internal negotiations under the surface of the dictatorship. And out of these and other questions, the Sinnwelt project was born. By the way, the German term Sinnwelt, and now I'm coming to this terminology, is actually uneasy to translate. As you heard already, we use all the time the German word, I mean, as Pavel Kolář and Michal Kopeček put it, Sinn in this context denotes not only meaning or sense. In the framework of the project, we were concerned with the broader mental conception and social construction of the word, its idea of the word, as opposed to the narrowly defined word of the material reality of socialism. So this Sinnwelt comprised the everyday sort of little utopia of a wide variety of actors, rank and file communists, dissidents, professional economists, housewives, urban planners, local policemen, and so on. It can therefore be usefully understood as the space of the pre-political acceptance of socialism, a zone in which historical actors daily constructed the meaning of the existing social order. With other words, the very aim of the project was to emancipate historiographical research of state socialist era from the focus on political history and history of oppression, and to analyze the pre-political aspects which help to build and stabilize or destabilize the system. To which extent, for example, did people identify state socialism with the broadly accepted notion of peace and quiet, security, social progress, welfare, efficient management, fair labor, progress, or normality? How did state socialism merge or conflict with beliefs or convictions which were deeply rooted in societies and co-created individual identities long time before communists came to power? Methodological inspiration hereby was mostly transferred in the classical way from the west to the east. However, the new approaches, especially to cultural and intellectual history, such as German Alltagsgeschichte, Foucaultian discourse analysis, and so on, were at the beginning of the 21st century, of course, already for a long time accepted and commonly used also in Central Eastern European historiographies, but mostly in fields which were not heavily politicized, such as the research of Middle Ages or early New Age. Our task was hereby to connect the research of state socialism with this research of other historical periods. So historicization, we believed and still believe, was not a matter of relativizing the communist crimes, but to understand and explain why things did happen. Communist rule from this perspective had in many moments and many countries a relatively broad legitimacy, and it is the role of a historian, as we believe, to analyze thus its legitimization strategies, such as the representation of social consensus, modernization in many spheres of life, accent on scientific knowledge, security, or fostering national narratives and sentiments. The goal of post-1989 historiography and even more politics of history was to emphasize abnormality of the socialist dictatorship for a long time in order to legitimize the post-socialist, mostly neoliberal government as the normal and in long term the only possible. The decades between the end of the Second World War and the end of the 80s were interpreted as a denial to a natural historical development, as an alien body in the story of the nation. Again, there are many sort of obvious abnormalities in state socialism, which no serious person can deny. However, the Sinnwelt project's ambition was to return this era to national and European history as one of its possible phases. The idea, therefore, was to analyze and understand how a world that now appears so strange developed organically and could have been viewed as normal in this sense. Normality here stands for internalized acceptance of the dictatorship, which did not rely only on fear and subjugation, but, as Martin Sabrow puts it, also on successful effort to ensure that its ways of thinking, values, words of meaning, and its political culture became normal and valid for the many sometime in the past. I'm coming to the end, but now the last sort of question or sub-question was actually what remained. This is a project which took place and sort of a struggle that took place 15 years, about 15 years past actually since the beginning of the Sinnwelt project, and more than 10 years since its last workshop. And one can be very pessimistic from our point of view. If you have the state-sponsored institutions fostering the one-sided oppression and violence-centered perspective on state socialist rule are still in operation, of course. Some of them being even more powerful and more directly politically operated than 15 years ago in some of our countries. And moreover, the Russian war against Ukraine brought back many of the understandable anti-Soviet sentiment and the demand of clear dichotomic images about good and evil. So one may ask, did actually projects as socialist dictatorship as Sinnwelt had any impact at all? Well, it is not surprising that as one of the former doctoral students who was taking part and who was methodologically influenced by the project, I nevertheless see some important contribution of it. We may not have been that successful in changing the dominant narrative and the public use of and misuse of history of state socialism in our countries in order to legitimize the current neoliberal or conservative policies. On the other hand, the project, at least in Czech Republic, but I think in other countries, maybe in synergy with other projects, other similar projects rooted there, somehow contributed to a major shift of researching, analyzing, and interpreting state socialism, at least in academic and scholarly milieu. Whereas 2007, Czech, Slovak, Polish and other scholars challenging the totalitarian paradigm in interpreting the pre-1989 era mostly had to search for inspiration exclusively in German and or English written historiographical literature, dealing mostly with the GDR or with the Soviet context. This is mostly not the case in 2022. A view of state socialist history which emphasizes the interconnectedness of domination on society is, at least in Czech scholarly community, no longer a marginal supplementary approach, but is becoming a actually dominant conception. Dozens of especially younger scholars shed light on everyday life of the many in state socialism, on the role of experts in its, to a great extent, technocratic rule, on work and living environment, gender ambiguities, or on dynamics of ideology, which no longer is interpreted just as an imposed doctrine. So this branched out and diversified research is vividly connected, interconnected also with international scholarship, often comparatively designed, and in last years also interdisciplinary, as those doing contemporary history tend to exchange their knowledge with sociologists, urbanists, urban geographers and others. So this all happened. I mean, it had many reasons and many sources, and of course it is difficult to measure which role the Sinnwelt project has played in its development, but for my generation, definitely it was an important impulse, and how much this will be a lasting impact, this has to be judged one day by our students or the students of our students. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you for setting up this historiographical, conceptual framework, but also a reflection of nowadays situation. And it's great to hear that after even though that the current situation, it might not seem that optimistic, but it's great to hear that the Sinnwelt project actually had some material impact on wider historiography, and especially on the students and on new approaches. And now when we have all this framework set up, I would like to ask you both to shortly explain how did you employ this concept in your empirical studies which are presented in this book. So can you shortly elaborate about this, please?
Okay, thank you. Yes, for within the project, I was a PhD student in the Sinnwelt project, and my dissertation was about the development of two towns that were built after the Second World War in Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, Velenje and Havěřov. And I would just like briefly mention, because we last night I talked with Matej and Matej about with Matej we remember the beginnings of the project, and I remembered how thrilled I was, and also really very surprised that I got a grant in an international project about a very local topic. This was very, very surprising for me. But in my article for the collective volume, I concentrated only on the case of Velenje, and I investigated the voluntary practices in the municipality and its local communities within the system of Yugoslav self-management. I investigated how residents engaged in local politics or participatory practices by concentrating on different types of local communities. So I investigated the difference between urban or rural communities, old or new ones, so the local communities of which settlements were established already before the war, or in different decades after the war. And I looked at different voluntary practices, those traditional, originated already in the 19th century, like engagement in different voluntary associations, or after the war in voluntary actions in the post-war reconstruction, or for the construction of the new town, or later in the 1970s and 80s, the engagement in the self-imposed contributions. And in order to investigate how successful the policies of development through voluntary practices were, I investigated the connectedness of inhabitants through the concept of social capital. And Matej was mentioning earlier the pre-political concepts, and that it was here where we can look for the sources of communist domination and support for it. And this pre-political space comprised non-ideological notions, values, and practices, which to most of the people seemed normal in everyday life. And in my article, I looked at values of such as solidarity, trust, and the feeling of belonging in local community. This represented the space, or Sinnwelt, where the residents daily constructed the meaning of the existing order, and its legitimacy was repeatedly re-established. In the article, I discuss the support for the solidarity between urban and rural local communities, and then to the notion in the 1980s, I quote here, "I have no trust in my local community anymore." So the functioning of the system, as I see I argue in the article, dependent on similar values and objectives which bound the community together. And then when together with the economic crisis in the 1980s and the new paradigm of individuality entered the community, lacking inner cohesion and a sense of solidarity, then also the ideological infrastructure started to crumble, in short.
All right, thank you very much, very interesting. And Matej, can you continue with your work?
Okay, thank you. I will. I will first talk about what I did in the framework directly at the time of when the project was running, and then actually what became a part of this book is sort of the next research or next project. So what I did as my dissertation project at that time, 10-15 years ago, was I don't have an English. There is no English translation. There is just a German one. I can just, if you want to look on it. It is a research and became a book about the situation in the Czech borderlands after the expulsion of the German population, and after sort of what I studied was the question of this post-war nationalism and the building of a new society, which was accompanied by very nationalistic ideology and rhetorics, and at the same time the new society actually was quite heterogeneous, because 10,000s or nearly like 200,000 of Germans stayed for various reasons, and also people from abroad, like re-immigrants who often didn't speak Czech came, Roma population from Eastern Slovakia came to the borderlands, so you had a very heterogeneous society. And the question was, how did this developed not only in the 40s but also in the 50s as in the process of building of communist dictatorship? How did actually communists also cope with nationalism, with the ethnic minorities, and how this was connected with the legitimacy of the new regime. the one thing which somehow opposed the traditional narrative was the question of, or was, let's say, showing the demand for physical violence against those who, from many perspectives, from actually the perspective of the majority, did not belong to the nation, or then after that to the progressive parts of the nation. So what I was showing was that there is also again a sort of pre-political, that the violence, which was often somehow so in the sort of grand narrative, the post-war expulsion of Germans was sort of geopolitical thing which was somehow which somehow belongs to well, the history of diplomacy after the war. They were transferred and so on, and there was some couple of years of sort of democracy in Czechoslovakia, and then 48 the communists came and they ruled by violence and were dominating the society. And what I showed was that the actually most violent period of Czech and Czechoslovak post-war history was exactly these first years after the war, where in the course of the expulsion tens of thousands of people were killed, and that there was a huge demand for physical violence and for cleansing the society, and that actually all communists who were involved in this process, they could very very efficiently use this demand for cleansing the society for their purposes. And after 48, not only against let's say ethnic minorities, but against other societal actors and groups. So it's again about this internal sort of legitimacy of a system which is partly based also on physical violence or on cleansing the society. The other aspect which I found actually in the sources, and which was quite obvious, was the very ambivalence of the communist politics or policies towards these minorities, as sort of the changing of the policies, and also partly goal to integrate these minorities somehow in the society. So the ambivalence of emancipatory and repressive policies. So that was the dissertation project. This book was translated just to German, so I don't have it in English. But the next book I can also show is the book about this city of Most. Anna was actually already talking about the study or the article which is published in the book, and this is a part of the bigger research about a city which was a historical medieval city which was demolished because of coal mining, and where a new city was built in the 60s, and from the 60s to the early 80s, sort of realization of a modernist utopia. The city's name in Czech is Most, so it's not only making the most of tomorrow, but making the most of tomorrow. And it's actually this about, to a great extent, I would say that there are two sort of main arguments. Well, the one is to show how important the technocratic moment was in state socialist dictatorships, that there was a sort of in the 60s and 70s continuity of very technocratic thinking, which gave great opportunity to technical experts and experts in industry to realize these projects like that. And then the second part of the book is showing how critique of this project was developing, critique from environmental positions, from the position of historical preservation, of course, because a very valuable medieval town was demolished, and also sort of humanistic critique of the anonymous modernist way of building cities. And the interesting thing is that also the ruling elites, and especially the official experts, accepted somehow partly this critique in the end of the 60s, during the 70s, and especially in the 1980s. The paradox, which I also show in this article, is that the time when the new originally sort of utopian modernist city was actually built was already the time when not only the broad public, but also the experts and the ruling elites who standing behind building this town were actually quite critical already to projects like that. So this sort of great utopia turned into something what was quite contradictory, and what became in the very end of the 80s sort of a shame of the regime. So that's the project which you can read something about in the book.
Okay, thank you. Since Matej already told us about some kind of afterlife of this project in his personal research, and also a bit more general, Anna, can you also tell us, like, what impact did this project and this conceptual framework you met dealing with this project? How did this influence your further research and ideas about state socialist regimes in general?
Well, maybe I would first like to say that well, Matej already mentioned that a lot has happened since the last workshop of the Sinnwelt project, and has a kind of a semi-pessimistic view of the impact. But nevertheless, I do think that that at the time the Sinnwelt concept might represented an alternative that during the last decade the concept or its variations nevertheless already entered the mainstream research in various in different studies, in gender studies or environmental studies or intellectual studies. After the end of the Sinnwelt project, I was actually already writing my postdoc project, and first I wanted to research Yugoslav non-alignment movement in connection, or how it in connection to the local environment, to the environment, to the municipalities and local communities. But then it turned out this way that for my postdoc I was working in a project which was about voluntary associations in the post-socialist period, and both of these fields, I think, the history of Eastern Europe in connection to the global South, and the history of post-socialist transition, actually rapidly developed in the last decade or so. Nevertheless, I think that we need to consider also to go back, or to direct our focus on the local and to state socialism, also in comparison with Western countries, which is also there are already some projects and studies comparison of Eastern Europe with Western or capitalist states, and my next project, which you mentioned within the Marie Curie grant, will concentrate on women's engagement in voluntary associations, mostly in rural areas, in the border region of Slovenia, Austria, and Hungary after the First World War until the end of the Cold War. And I will look this on two levels. On the one hand, the role I will look what role they played in the women played in the local voluntary fire departments, and on the other, how these village women participated and engaged in international firefighting organization, and how this shaped patterns of women engagement and emancipation at home.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And I would just like to say that I believe that this book is a really good example how those micro-histories can build a wider image and really expose this complexity of relations and negotiations between the state and society. So let's hope that there will be more such projects and more such collections as you edited and wrote, obviously. And I think that our time is up, so I'm opening the floor for any questions from the public or the web. Anyone? Marco, please.
Maybe this, I really like your presentation of the book and your reflection. I must say that your book is, due to the fact that some things have gone to the worst in East and Central Europe, your book is even more precious due to this fact. It's like a very bright kind of side of the to look for it. But I was thinking, I really like your explanation and this also about the historical narrative of socialist world, how this system has new societies, new states, new capitalist democratic societies. Of course, they have to legitimize themselves by saying that this old regimes were bad as it gets, and it even gets worse now, since we are proceeding to the future. But I was trying then to think about Yugoslavia's Slovenian position, Slovenian situation, and I must say I've noticed one thing. In Slovenia, the word regarding Yugoslav socialism, only here the word dictatorship, the term dictatorship is of course completely accepted by international historical community, also in Eastern Central Europe. But in Slovenian context, I think that only revisionist kind of historians would use the word dictatorship regarding Yugoslav Slovenian socialism. And I'm not saying it's bad, I'm not saying it's good, but that is something that I have noticed. And of course, those are precisely those historians, or those wannabe historians, those para-historians who are trying to construct the story that you have to notify us about this image of dark image, only repression and everything, which is, I suppose, in Yugoslav or in Slovenian case even more strange, because it's hard to see. Also, the Sinnwelt, I find it very much relevant also for Yugoslav socialism, even more in a way, because this it's hard to divide even from structurally societal position. What was the power? What of the social political organization was a part of the state, when which were not part of the state? So if you have, I read partially your book. It's wonderful. You can see it's a good thing. Maybe it's a good thing that you've done it. So maybe you were. It was a process. It's really a profound book. But I've seen this. It's not either. It's not binary, but it's usually about the world between. And I have a feeling that in Slovenian socialism, this word between is also there. Not because I was told that we were better in socialism and so on, but because the nature of Yugoslav system of socialism, the self-management, was even more diffuse, even more defragmented. So maybe I would like to, if you comment on that, and Anna, if she can comment on that,
Yes.
please. I don't know if it was clear.
Yeah, thank you, Marco, for this comment. I usually say this story in the evening when we have with a beer, but now I will tell it in front of the camera. So in 2007, when I received the letter of the letter for the application for the Sinnwelt project, I remember quite vividly. I was sitting at home, and there was the title of the project was Sozialistische Diktatur als Sinnwelt, and I thought, oh my God, what is this? In 2007, in my mind, this was like some totalitarian paradigm that is going to be discussed. But then there was this word Sinnwelt. And, Matej would know my German was not really very good at the time. And I thought Sinn and Welt, and then dictatorship and Sinnwelt, and I thought this is strange. So so I thought, okay, I will apply, and if I see that this is nothing for me, I can always say no, thank you, but no, thank you. And so I stay, and then it took me a while actually to understand that that the discussion about dictatorship is what it was in this group. It was actually already the alternative to the totalitarian paradigm. So it was confusing, and also when we were discussing about the title of for the book, it was a long discussion between the editors, and also Pavel and Michal. So
it's interesting that you say that this dictatorship actually is in opposing to post-totalitarian or anti-totalitarian discourse.
But I have to understand this in order to somehow, this is how it. When we work in a international, or when we try to compare when we work in a comparison or international environment. But it's your comment is what I was just remembering how it was for me when I at the time when I applied. So I almost didn't apply because of dictatorship in the title.
Maybe to go on with the comment, and that's why I think it's very important to for us in Slovenian Yugoslav space, those who are researching those, it's not so obvious. It's even more important to read, and to be even more profound read this kind of book, because it gives us a lot of opportunity conceptually to understand our society also through Sinnwelt. And it's something that I think it's a good concept to understand that our own project that it's going to make about Socialist Alliance, which is the huge socialist the biggest social organization, which was somewhere between the state and not the state, between the people that's intended to be there in a way. So I think this Sinnwelt concept could help us also. It's one of the conceptual apparatus, and I would like to thank you for that. And if you could comment too.
Thank you. Yeah, it is. It's always the problem with the terminology in these international projects, because different terms have just different framing and different sort of history of understanding the terms in different scholarly cultures. I think this term. In this particular case, it comes from the German scholarship and their sozialistische Diktatur or SED-Diktatur, so the dictatorship of the Communist Part of the Sozialistische Einheitspartei of the party. These are sort of analytical terms. It's sort of authoritarian rules or dictatorship with the communist or socialist ideology. So let's say communist or socialist dictatorship, and this was sort of in not only in this project, but the struggle is against the term totalitarian regime, which is suggesting that this was something else than other dictatorships in human history, because sort of not only that a party or a group of people sort of dominated the political space, but actually totalitarian means in this sense that, coming out of Arendt's and other texts, that actually the people were sort of their way of thinking and so on was dominated by the overall ideology and so on. And in this discussion, dictatorship actually is a more analytical term, suggesting that okay, it was a authoritarian rule, but at the same time the society does not have to have been a passive actor and so on. So it's totally different framing of the word than I think in the Yugoslav context, where dictatorship, as you put it, was always more used by people who actually have the more totalitarian point of view. So this is of course always a bit, but I would say also in the books and studies written, there is a plurality of terms. We use quite a lot state socialism as a term, which is sort of maybe can be accepted in all of these countries. Or when we use dictatorship, I think mostly we use it in connection with the particular parties as a dictator or Communist Party of Czechoslovakia dictatorship and so on. So there is a plurality of these terms, and I think it's important to note that there is no one term which is the proprius, which is the sort of this terminology is still in the making, and it's still part of the discussion, and it also contemporary history is archaeology of the present time. So it's also important what actually in which discussion about also our society today we are sort of engaged, and that also somehow has impact on how we use the terminology regarding the communist past. So this is a dynamic process, I would say.
Great, thank you. We have another question. Isidora first, and Aleš next, and Matej.
Thank you, I enjoyed the talk very, very much. And just to follow up to what Marko was saying, I'm now wondering what were the alternative titles of the book, but you don't have to share that, only if you want to. But my question was actually about periodization, and it's quite a broad question, so I'm just interested in what you're going to say. You already discussed it a bit, but I'm wondering to what extent, and maybe give us some more insight into to what extent your research challenges this very accepted periodization with these big breaks of 45, 68, 89, and what new does it bring. And I'm especially interested in this continuity with the interwar period that you discussed, but also more broadly.
So the alternative, the alternative titles. I think we were discussing whether we should put Sinnwelt in the title. This was we were not how to. it's yeah. So whether it should be yeah, this was the main to put it, instead of dictatorship, to put Sinnwelt in the title. And about the breaks, well, I am looking for the continuities within, for example, in the case of voluntary work, voluntary associations. What were the continuities from the pre-Second World War period and then into the Second World War, and how it builds then on the previous decades, then in the post-war period. Maybe just show you.
Yeah, well, in my own work, it's very, to put it simply, actually, every research I do is opposing some of the important sort of rupture, political rupture, and in this way opposing the classical periodization. The first this book about the post-war borderlands actually was polemizing with the 1948, with putting 1948 in Czechoslovakia, or thinking 1948 as the year when everything changed because communists came to power. What I showed there was the continuity between this way of struggling for a new society in the immediate post-war time, which then had a great impact of on the character of the communist rule in the very late 40s and early 50s. So this was sort of against this type of political history perspective that 1948 everything changed from democracy to dictatorship. Then the next book about Most actually shows the continuities between the 1960s and 70s. Sort of in opposing the very accent on 1968 and the beginning of the end of reform socialism and beginning of the so-called normalization in Czechoslovakia, where I show on one hand the continuities of technocratic rule from the 60s to the 70s beyond, let's say, the political constellation, and on the other hand also the continuities of sort of critique or changing of beliefs which sort of are starting in the 1960s, the more sort of critical reflection of some modernist view on urban development, environment, and so on, which also continues to 1970s and 80s. And what I do now in the last years actually can be called something as looking at the long 1980s, like the long transition, where we with colleagues show that once we have to explain the 1990s, we have to go back to the late 70s and 80s, where actually the big transformation of sort of the dominant way of thinking about society is happening, coming to the sort of individualism and the ideology of entrepreneurism and so on. Everything starts under the surface of late socialism, and once we want to explain how it was possible that things happened in such a fast way in the 1990s. Why, I don't know, everything what was connected with plan was suddenly criticized and bad, and everything what was sort of individual freedom and so on. So this is against struggling with 1989 as a but I think it's a classical discussion between social and cultural history, which is my field of and the sort of classical political history, which is more stressing the sort of the political ruptures.
Mm.
but a very good question, I think. This is one of the core of the...
event and structure.
Yeah.
Okay, Ales, please.
I just wanted to add a comment on this terminology. I think that totalitarianism and dictatorship, the totalitarianism comes more from the right parties and from those institutes you mentioned, Zgodovina, then the Polish Institute and Hungarian Institute, but we also have in Slovenia such an institute. But I must say, it was easily to speak openly at Poland or at Prague than it is at the Ljubljana Institute. Of course, I know that, as Andrzej Wojciechowski told me last month, it is some changing in the development in Prague, so you are going on the opposite way. So for me, it was very interesting to hear you talking about impact of your project. I think that we must ask about the impact, but on the other hand, I think as a historian we must do such projects. Because when you were talking, I was thinking about the Germans after 1945. We did not know, or we could not know. If you do such a project, nobody can say we could not know. If you don't read, if you don't want to know, then you don't know. But now you had the chance, decide, and you have a book, and now you can read it. So you could know, and this is I think the impact for the students and for the society, that we give them the opportunity of the other story. And about the totalitarian discourse or something like that, I think that those who are going with the way with that discourse, they never actually read Hannah Arendt. Because if they read Hannah Arendt, they would know that in her book there is no argument for the narrative. And if they really read the declaration of the destruction of the totalitarian reign from 2009, if they read it to the end, in the last sentences where it's reached, no political structure or no political party or no state apparatus could dictate us the terminology and our attitude towards history, then they would see that they have no argument in such a thing about which they're talking and they repeat it 10 times a week, but they didn't read it. And the second thing, maybe I was thinking also like the Isadora mentioned, it would be interesting to go in the 90s with Sinnwelt project. Why? Because then the people would ask themselves not just what we got with after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but what we lost. Because, and I see the Sinnwelt, if I understand it properly, and I of course read it from the 10 years ago from your translations and publishing in Slovene. It was when it started. For my opinion, it started like Isadora asked. When the people said this is our system, and it was from 50s and from 60s, and this is about social and cultural history. This comparison with the West would give us some answers. Why, for example, the employment of the women was in some socialist states easier than it was in the West, like comparing to the West. Why, for example, it's for some of my colleagues from the high school, so not problematic, but shocking to hear what they don't have in the West, but they think it's normal, because we were used to, from socialism, that it was normal. For example, to have good food in the school, to have good health system, and something like that. So I think that it would be interesting to go with such projects in the 90s, to see what the people from those countries, how do they see the past, in the, not just what we got with democracy, but what we lost from with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment, Aleš, and I think that...
Yeah, I would just like to shortly respond. Thank you, Aleš, for this comment. There were some projects within the Sinnwelt project that also tried to go beyond 1989, but then I think Micha's and Anina's, but then at the end they decided to limit themselves to state socialism, and Pavel Koláš and Michal Kopeček they write in their introduction in the book that yes, this book concentrates or implies Sinnwelt within the state socialist period, but it can also be applied for other periods also, or regimes also, the one that we live right now.
Let me comment on both of your questions. The first one, thank you very much for your wishes, but at the same time I'm a bit maybe a bit more skeptical. As I put it also in my talk, I mean the impact definitely is can be seen in the academic historiography, but I would not overestimate our, let's say, influence on the broader society. I mean, once there is a struggle between the critical science and the politics of history, or let's say official historical education, I am afraid that as scientists, we don't really have the instruments to sort of influence the broader society. We can do that once there is as in the German case, for example, once there is a good collaboration between historical science, historical education, and politics of history. Then, of course, the critical science is important because that is the source of knowledge for the other spheres of sort of broadening the knowledge. But once there is a sort of struggle, a fight against these, then the possibilities of the critical science to deliver their knowledge to say ordinary people and to pupils in grammar school and on high schools are limited, and that's exactly the in the time of a struggle or a rupture between critical science and these other ways to sort of deliver some knowledge about the past, what we live through today in Czech Republic, in Poland, Hungary, and so on. So there, actually, I don't know how to do it. I mean, it's important that we do not limit ourselves just to the very nice environment of scholars and our students, but it's not so easy to come out of it and really have some impact. So that's just a bit of a skeptical comment to the first question. Historicizing 1990s, I think this is the great task, and this is, I was already talking about it in the connection with the last or latest projects we did with Michal Kopeček and others. There is a book named Architects of the Long Change, which is about the expert milieus from the 1970s to mid-1990s. So already somehow looking to the 1990s and showing the continuities. And this is, for me, it's also the task now. Now I have a project about urban changes in the 80s and 90s in Czechoslovakia, comparing Prague and Bratislava with other colleagues, and this is exactly the question, explaining what actually changed, what we what we gained, what we lost, when we put it simply, but actually really explaining the problems of our present time, which are rooted in the 90s and even before, and connecting these studies of late socialism and post-socialism. So I totally agree.
Just a comment to the first. Of course, there should be also historians who, let's say, sacrifice to those who you mentioned the first, to break the wall between science and impact in school or in high school or something like that. So that's why I'm also the author of some textbooks, and I was also the president of the Commission for History Matura for some time. But I know that what is the wall. For the rehabilitation, you get the point just if you are on the pedagogical work at the university. This work for 10 years gives you no point, or I will probably lose my habilitation in the university. Because of that, I crossed that bridge.
Okay, so the last question goes to Matej, please.
Thank you very much. Aleš already asked my question basically, so I put like Sinnwelt in the 90s, the question. But nonetheless, I would like to firstly thank you for a great presentation, and secondly, maybe try to slightly reframe the question of Sinnwelt in the 90s, maybe not to talk about maybe like what gets lost or something like that, but maybe how the negotiation process kind of emerged and functioned on this Eigensinn level maybe, or like how an individual or some groups would negotiate their positions with the new dominant narratives, with the state actually, and with the let's say in the case of entrepreneurship, for example, the individual self-made persons maybe, or something like that, and how this, if you think that to what extent this is maybe manageable, plausible, vital. Yeah, that would be maybe my question.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I was putting it really very simply. Of course, it's not. Is not the main question, like what we gained, what we lost, but this, of course, this negotiation is very. It's not surprising. I mean, in the sort of liberal environment, this is not so provoking as in authoritarian rule. That different societal groups were negotiating their position. The very interesting thing, I mean, what I learned from the Sinnwelt methodological background and is useful for the 90s is also this. It's a sort of a way to understand, or the ambition to understand how people. What was the sort of small utopia of the different groups of people, and that as well as in communist times, also in the 90s, there were not only pragmatic goals of the people, also of the political elites or of the let's say regional elites and so on. That there always is an interaction between sort of individual or group interests, pragmatic interests, and some type of ideology, of sort of word of meaning, of thinking about what is the good word, what should be world and society shaped like. And this is very important also, not to for example, not to criminalize the 1990s, because one can tend to sort of way of the not only of the mafia, but also the 1990s politics of privatization and so on, to see everything just from a very critical perspective, that actually everybody wanted just to somehow gain something for him or herself. But what is important is that all this was actually possible because people were believing in some values, such as the individual responsibility of an owner, for example, and things like that. That actually it was the 1990s are also, there is this sort of word of meanings of small utopias, and we have to, we are here not to show how problematic and bad this time was and how many problems it caused, but we are here as historians because we have to explain how this came to be, why things happened, and what were actually people believing in when they were acting. So this is, I think, what is really what can be actually learned from this sort of Sinnwelt methodological background and used for the 1990s, from my point of view. Yeah.
But I think that when you put it like this, it's even more provoking for the like post-dissident understanding of socialism or post-socialism than to apply the Sinnwelt concept for the dictatorship. Because you presume that there is an ideological framework in the 90s, which is supposed to be like this post-ideological space.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it might be provoking also in the discussion with the sort of post-dissident point of view, but it might be and can be provoking also with the leftist position, which is sort of stigmatizing for good reasons, but stigmatizing the 1990s. And again, as historians, we have to look under the surface and to explain and not to judge a priori. So this it might be. I mean, we are looking forward to it. It might be an interesting time to historicize the 1990s.
Okay, I think we have to conclude at this point because the time is up. Thank you very much to our guests for your insights, reflections, and thank you to the public for a really vivid discussion. And since it's the last event of the festival, may I thank Anna for being the power engine behind it and bringing to Ljubljana all these great scholars and giving us a lot of food for thoughts. And final words, perhaps?
Yeah, thank you. We had a very intensive month, and today is the last day. We forgot to mention that on the flyer today, Celia Donert, the co-editor of the book, supposed to join us. Unfortunately, she couldn't, and we also had to postpone her lecture that was scheduled for 11:30, hopefully to fall this or later this year. Nevertheless, yes, I think we had really wonderful events, wonderful lectures, and it would not be possible without a great team here at the Institute. And I would like now to thank Neja Bleich-Ribar, Natasha Frank, Karin Konda, Marko Kupljen, Natasha Rozman, Urška Svetina, Sergej Škofljanec, Tina Tratnik, Darja Vipelc, and to Marko Zajc. And I would also like to thank to all the presenters, all the moderators, all the chairs, and of course the audience for all the great debates. And hopefully see you next year at the next festival. But thank you.